Hello everyone, I'm EDJ, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going back to good old Historia Civilis. We're going to be looking at his video called The Year Without a Summer, 1816 to 1824. So 1816 is an interesting year, fresh off the Napoleonic Wars, so I'm assuming this is just going to be how Europe is adjusting to post-Napoleonic era and whatever political troubles. I'm imagining characters such as Castlereagh and the Austrian, Metternich. Metternich, who helped, with the treaty and the rearranging of Europe. I guess we're gonna see the immediate after effect, right? Aftermath of that, and just how Europe is adjusting now that it's quote-unquote put back to normal, or at least as normal as it could be post that Napoleon guy who messed everything up, like, if you know what I mean. So yeah, other than that, I don't know what fully to look forward into, so without any further ado, we should just get into this. Let's watch The Year Without a Summer by Historia Civilis.
It was 1816, and after almost 25 years of unrelenting warfare, Europe had been at peace for 1 year. The reprieve had been a blessing. In England, one could see a familiar sight. The wind was still bitterly cold, and the sky was still grey, but the snow was finally starting to retreat from the hills, and the trees had just begun to bloom. Farmers shuffled about in their fields, fretting over whether they planted too early. They took inventory of their winter stores, and wondered if they might go hungry before the first harvest came in. These were all normal sights for the early spring, but this year, something had gone terribly wrong. This was all happening in June. They called 1816 the year without a summer. It happened for complicated reasons, but basically there was an unlucky combination of volcanic eruptions that altered global weather patterns for 2 or 3 years. In some parts of the world, the changes were relatively minor and went by unnoticed, but in others, the changes were catastrophic. In Europe, they happened to be catastrophic.
You know what that reminds me of? Wait. I remember, like, many years ago, I would go on YouTube and then just find these random videos. The worst year ever. Okay, yeah, so the worst year ever, 536, and I remember seeing these videos years ago. They would just pop up randomly in my feed about this infamous year of 536, and if I remember correctly, I'm hoping I'm getting at least the right event. It was mainly about how, a volcanic eruption emerged, and I think the sun wasn't fully visible for a year, and that caused a lot of issues. And I believe it had to do with volcanic eruptions. I'm probably getting so much wrong because I haven't seen this in many years, but that's kind of what I sort of remember, if memory serves. And, that played volcanic eruptions, I believe, and, the basically vanishing of the sun, I think also plague all had a hand in that year, so some people have turned to it as calling it the worst year in human history. So, yeah, I don't know, I got reminded of that,
That July turned out to be the coldest July on record. That summer turned out to be the coldest summer on record. That decade of the 1810s would be the coldest decade in 500 years, all the way back to the 1300s. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, so it was unusually cold. But the problem wasn't just that it was cold. The problem was that nothing grew. Most plants don't really grow unless the temperature is above 10 degrees Celsius. In London, England, it's below 10 degrees for about 66 days on the average year. In 1816, it was below 10 degrees for 146 days, which meant that there were significant non-growing periods scattered throughout the spring and into the summer. That fact alone would have been enough, but there was another issue. The changes to the weather caused most of Europe to be unusually overcast and rainy. Farmers in France usually had to deal with 8 days of rain per month in the summer. In 1816, they had 20 days of rain per month. In England, crops had just begun to sprout when they got 8 straight weeks of rain. The rain led to flooding, and wherever there was flooding, crops failed. Northern France and the Netherlands basically turned into one giant swamp. On average, the cold temperatures and the rain pushed the harvest 1 month later than it should have been. In France, it was more like 2 months. Farmers relied on early harvests to replenish their stores and get them through the summer. But this year, with the harvest pushed back a month or more, you instead saw widespread famine in the early summer. It became common to see people picking through abandoned fields that had been lost to flood, eating unripened or rotten plants straight out of the mud. This was how Europe's century of peace began. After 25 years...
Yeah, talk about a bad way to, to start, right? Like, finally, we got rid of that Corsican ogre Napoleon and this frickin' happens, you know? Maybe it's like Mother Nature mourning the loss of the epicness of the Napoleonic era, you know? But, yeah, that doesn't usher in that's not a good omen, right? It does not usher in the highest of confidences.
Years of war. After sending an entire generation of young men into the meat grinder, people were reduced to picking through the fields for rotten food. What was it all for? The environmental catastrophe was nobody's fault, but people were furious at their own governments for allowing this to happen. And nowhere were they more furious than in France.
Yeah, that makes sense.
France was broke, the people were starving, and the country was in the middle of an environmental catastrophe. The restored King Louis XVIII had come to power promising to lift a bunch of unpopular taxes on the poor, but he was immediately forced to break that promise. The grumbling began immediately. Conditions in France had never been this bad under Napoleon. As part of the compromise that restored the king to power, France operated under a new liberal constitution. But the constitution was weak. France now held regular elections, but the king had the power to throw out the results whenever he wished. His ministers did not answer to the public, they answered to him. This actually made the new system weak and fragile. Say what you will about the British system, but at least the British Prime Minister took most of the heat. If things were really going badly, replacing the Prime Minister was an uncomplicated and yet meaningful act. Now, too, but their Prime Minister was just an extension of the King's will. If things were really going badly, replacing the Prime Minister would not be enough. They may need to replace the King. The restored...
Yeah, considering the French have many more revolutions after the first one, you can kind of see why. And obviously the biggest issue, the king, the Bourbon monarchy is still way too powerful. And yeah. Again, this situation though isn't completely old Louis's fault. He just happened to inherit a really bad situation, at least in this regard with the famine. So I do kind of feel for the man, unfortunately, and, the people need something to blame, so that's kind of the problem with being a monarch, especially one that's absolute. You either get all the love or all the hate, So, that just comes with the territory of being king,
King Louis XVIII wisely selected a liberal named Richelieu as his first prime minister. The centrists in France at this time were extremely supportive of the new French constitution, were comfortable with many of the reforms of the French Revolution, and also favored the restoration of the monarchy. They were trying to split the difference between the ultra-conservatives, who favored increasing the power of the king and the aristocracy, and the Republicans, who wanted to disseminate more power to the people and continue the work of the French Revolution. The king favored the ultra-conservatives, but he correctly assessed that there would be a popular uprising if he came out of the gates pushing their agenda. The centrists would have to do for now.
Yeah, that's just smart. Good move on you there, Louis. And, that was a pretty shrewd move. And I think the thing is, yeah, obviously, you don't want to support the ultra-conservatives because you will appear way too biased. Probably it would be seen as a power grab, right? Like, okay, he just wants to undo the new constitution and the reforms that maybe some people really liked from the French Revolution and instantly roll back everything. So that makes sense. If he went for that, that would be seen as a power grab, right? By everyone. Probably, I think it would make the situation escalate. And obviously, you don't want to, at least in his situation, if you're looking at it through him, you don't want to support the Republicans. The freaking revolution basically removed the Bourbon monarchy from power, and prominent figures like Marie Antoinette beheaded. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. You don't want that. So yeah, this was the safe option, right? Or the best of both worlds, I guess you can say.
The selection of Richelieu was perhaps the wisest decision the king ever made. Richelieu was a steady hand and inspired trust abroad. In 1818, he successfully negotiated with the great powers for the removal of the armies that were occupying France, and for the end of France's reparation payments. In only 3 years, Richelieu had returned France to its rightful place as an equal great power, and
dang, fast worker, eh, this Richelieu. Instantly. That's amazing, actually. That's really cool. Considering France was basically the public enemy of the world under Napoleon, the fact that he managed to basically kind of bring it back into the fold with the rest of Europe peacefully without reparations and without being occupied, that's impressive, actually, like when you think about it, right? Wow.
And it had all been done diplomatically. France didn't even have to fight a war to re-establish itself on the international stage. A small miracle. But Richelieu was not rewarded for his hard work. For 3 elections in a row, the French Republican left made substantial gains in their annual elections. The king was forced to dismiss Richelieu in favor of a prime minister who could draw support from the Republicans. Obviously, this went against everything that the king stood for, and without the king's support, this new prime minister was not able to achieve anything meaningful. Let's pause there for now. France had successfully reintegrated itself back into the international system by forging a moderate path led by centrists like Richelieu. France's politics had settled around a grand compromise between the royalist ultra-conservatives, the liberal centrists, and the radical republicans. France would have a monarchy and a liberal constitution, and it would keep the reforms of the French Revolution. France would have an aristocracy, but it would also have elections. It wasn't quite a democracy yet, but it was on that path. Hold all of this in your head, because it will become important in a future video. While liberalism was taking hold in France, that wasn't necessarily true for the rest of continental Europe. Over in the newly formed German Confederation, German nationalism was on the rise, and the other great powers were getting nervous. The 2 German great powers had different reactions to the nationalist movements within their borders. In the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire, the instinct was to tamp it down. In the mostly German-speaking Prussia, they decided to lean into it. The King of Prussia sent Hardenberg, his prime minister and foreign minister, to meet with Metternich the Chancellor and Foreign Minister of Austria. The Prussians wanted to reform the German Confederation, to which both Prussia and Austria were members. Riding the wave of German nationalism, the Prussians wanted to revive talks of a united German empire, uniting the German-speaking peoples of Central Europe under one state. This new state would instantly become a new great power, with enough strength on their own to rival France. Hardenberg proposed that Prussia and Austria roll their territory into this new empire. But if that proved to be impossible, he alternately proposed that they could create a smaller German empire from the various small German states. In this scenario, Prussia and Austria could remain independent and control this new, smaller German empire as allies from the outside. Metternich was horrified by this idea. After such careful and difficult negotiation at the Congress of Vienna to create the German Confederation, Prussia wanted to blow it all up after only 3 years? Why? What was wrong with how the Confederation was working? The German states had agreed to band together for military defense and to resist outside meddling. It was working. Central Europe was at peace. Prussia and Austria had the strength and the leverage to force their tiny German allies to do whatever they wished. Wasn't that enough? Why on earth would Prussia want to start negotiations all over again? Metternich's analytical mind went to work.
Okay, so this is very interesting, I think. It's interesting to see the talk of a united Germany off the bat. I mean, we know Otto von Bismarck is the man who makes the German Empire a thing. That's a while from this. And you know, like, it's just interesting to see the talk of it this early on, you know, and like the idea being sown, like the seed being sown, if you would. And yeah, and Prussia, which inevitably, you know, obviously becomes a part of Germany, the German Empire, being basically the main, yeah, we want that, like that's just very interesting. And obviously I'm thinking of like the epic history video we saw a while back about the 1848 revolution and about what was going on in Germany, like this idea of unification, and even offering the Prussian king at the time, I think, the crown, right? Even though I'm pretty sure he refused, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I've seen that video. But it's just so interesting to see the seed already there, you know what I mean? And obviously, yeah, Metternich went through quite a lot with the Congress of Vienna, right? To get Europe the way it is. And yeah, why would he want to essentially, like, yeah, that's the thing about the Otto von Bismarck series. Like, Otto von Bismarck had to be really cunning and sly in order to get the full united Germany. Like, obviously he couldn't just do it completely overnight, because the sudden existence of a united Germany instantly becomes a major player, and it's like right in the center of Europe, right? Like suddenly overnight a new great empire that can rival its neighbors such as France is born, and everyone, the rest of Europe, would see that and be like, what? Like, you know, as we know, Euro politics, if one nation gets too strong, everyone's jumping it to curb its power. So instantly that would cause like war, like major conflicts if this just popped out of nowhere. So as we know, Otto von Bismarck, who always has a plan, had to work really hard in order to get this. And yeah, again, it's just interesting, I think.
Prussia and Austria controlled substantial Polish-speaking provinces in the east. If their new German Empire was home to a large Polish population, it's obvious what would happen next, isn't it? Poland would ask to join the German Empire. Don't you think the Tsar of Russia would have something to say about that? The Tsar of Russia was the king of Poland, and he had threatened a war in order to pull Poland into Russia's sphere of influence only 3 years earlier. The new German Empire would instantly be on the brink of war. To what purpose? Because a bunch of young Germans in Berlin got caught up in the nationalist mood of the moment and thought that a German empire sounded cool? What a mess. In order to appease Hardenberg and the German nationalists back in Prussia, Metternich proposed some minor reforms to the existing German Confederation so that it might feel a little more like a unified empire. The Confederation would operate a federal secret police to monitor any revolutionary activity. To the same end, freedom of the press would be standardized across the different German states and heavily restricted. Similarly, student associations at universities, traditionally a friendly home to revolutionary thought, would be outlawed across the Confederation. To allow for all of this, the Confederation as a whole would now be able to force individual states to modify their domestic laws in the name of preserving order. Of course, in practice, these modifications would not be coming out of the small German states. The modifications would be coming out of Prussia and Austria. All of these reforms have a certain flavor to them, don't they? Metternich was the conservative architect of the post-war order, and it's clear where his priorities lay. His singular focus was on preventing a French-style revolution from breaking out in Germany, an understandable fear, having just lived through 25 years of war. But I would argue that it was a preoccupation that drove him to distraction. We have the advantage of knowing what would happen in the future, and we know that debate over a potential German empire would be one of the key questions of the 19th century. Metternich had no way of knowing this, but there would be 3 wars fought over this issue, to say nothing of the 20th century, my god. I have no idea if Metternich's intervention at this point could have prevented any of those wars, but I do know that Metternich was a lot smarter than me, and when presented with this problem, he totally shrugged it off. He was so distracted thinking about 18th century France that he wasn't really thinking about 19th century Germany.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's obviously just the power of hindsight, right? Like, you can't fully predict everything that's gonna happen. And at the time, the Napoleonic Wars is such a hot topic. Like, it's only been a few years, you know what I mean? Like, Napoleon has given everyone PTSD. France has given everyone PTSD. Preventing that mess from happening again is top priority. That just makes sense, you know? It's hard to see, obviously, the future and all that would happen around Germany, you know, because a lot happens around Germany, as we know, from the 20th century and late 19th century, just so much happens, you know, so it makes sense. I could see that, like, obviously not everyone has the power of hindsight and, you know.
With Geico, we can easily bundle home and car insurance.
As part of the 1815 post-war settlement, Austria got control of northern Italy. As the Austrians moved into northern Italy, it fundamentally altered their national priorities. Before the war, Austria had been a pretty conservative and inward-looking power. Northern Italy turned Austria into an occupier and a colonizer, a role that Austria was ill-equipped to handle. Historian Paul W. Schroeder argued that Austria's expansion into northern Italy, quote, forced Austria to lead and organize Italy, yet did not really empower her to do so. Austria had to pump Italy for taxes just to offset the massive costs of occupying it in the first place. It was like a snake eating its own tail. The more difficult the occupation became, the more they taxed. The more they taxed, the more difficult the occupation became. Metternich was the mastermind of the occupation of Italy, and as the occupation began to deteriorate, he began to micromanage Italy's domestic policies. Another distraction. He brought in a wave of Germans from Austria to help administer the Italian occupation, which only further alienated the Italians and made the situation deteriorate even further. On the one hand, he was telling the German administrators to defer to the Italians whenever possible, while on the other hand, he was having the Austrian bureaucracy micromanage everything from Vienna. Colonization makes hypocrites of us all. Dissent was growing, and soon Austria found itself sitting atop a genuine nationalist movement calling for Italian unification. This was way more than the Austrians had bargained for. Metternich set up a robust spy network targeting Italian nationalists, but this did not make the Austrians any more popular. Even the more moderate Italians, who were willing to tolerate the Austrian occupation, began calling for a liberal Italian constitution. This was not a thing that the conservative icon Metternich could contemplate. Even geopolitically, the occupation of Italy made a mess of things for Austria. The Italian kingdom of Piedmont had been set up as a kind of neutral buffer state, so that Austria and France didn't have to share a border. But Austrian paranoia over Italian nationalism and their goonish spy network had soured relations with their Italian neighbor. For their own protection, Piedmont sought to establish deeper relations with France. This sent the Austrians into a paranoid tailspin. The French were establishing a beachhead in Italy, in Austria's backyard. Were the French behind the rising tide of Italian nationalism? The occupation of Italy had made Austria totally neurotic. This was a lesson that every great power would have to learn in the 19th century. The Austrian expansion into Italy may have looked good on a map, but the occupation did not generate any income, did not increase Austrian military prowess, and did not benefit Austria geopolitically. In the end, it was a total distraction from the important issues in Europe that were threatening the fragile peace. With Metternich up to his eyeballs with problems of his own making, it would fall to others to prevent the next great power conflict.
Yeah, it's interesting knowing what happens to Metternich. I think of the 1848 Revolutions video by Epic History, and Metternich eventually gets disgraced or exiled, you know. Things don't work out well for him. And, you know, when we think, yeah, I also remember, like, the Italians wanted unification, and it's funny because I'm pretty sure we saw the video from History March about when France and Austria go to war for, I believe it was for Italian independence. Wait, what was the battle called? Apologies, I'm just quickly looking through my History March playlist, because History March. Oh, sure, I have way too many videos on this freaking channel. Alright, where are you? Okay, at the Battle of Solferino. Yeah, so that was the battle. And it's funny that this all happens because obviously France and Napoleon III go to war to battle Austria, and I think the outcome was Austria losing its grip on Italy. So it's funny, like, Austria, Metternich in this, like, paranoia to, like, prevent the French Revolution and another Napoleon, creates this buffer state. But this buffer state then, like, teams up with France, and France ends up fighting for Italian independence against Austria, led by Napoleon no less, who goes on to beat Austria. Like, there's something kind of funny to all that, isn't it? And yeah, again, Metternich a smart man, and I would also agree, he's smarter than I could ever be, but obviously he's not infallible, and you kind of see it's interesting to see his shortcomings and his stumbles, if you would, you know, that even the smartest men make mistakes, and it is interesting to just see the mess he created for himself, you know.
The post-war international order faced its first major test in the 1820s. The King of Spain, restored to power after the defeat of Napoleon, turned out to be an absolutist ruler in the old 18th century style. This turned out to be a problem. 18th century Spain was dead and gone. When Napoleon was in power, he imposed a liberal constitution upon Spain, one that granted real political rights to its citizens. Virtually all adult men were given the right to vote, and with this change, political life within Spain flourished for the first time. Elections, newspapers, political debate, all of these things popped up within a few years, and the people loved it. So when the absolutist Spanish king was restored to the throne, his first move was to tear up the Spanish constitution and return things to how they had been in the 18th century. The Spanish legislature, which was full of proud Spanish liberals who loved their new constitution, were extremely vocal in their opposition. Radical Republicans and revolutionaries quickly joined forces with the more moderate liberals, which created a genuine political movement. Pretty soon, even generals in the Royal Army were coming out in support of the liberal legislature and the Constitution. The king was losing control of the country. Virtually overnight, Spain was on the brink of civil war.
That's hilarious. So it's interesting to see, because obviously when we talk about the Peninsula War and Napoleon's involvement in Spain, it's always a universal, that was a bad idea, awful, Napoleon, you suck, kind of situation there. But it's interesting to just hear that he made a change that people liked, because obviously when we talk about how everyone hated Napoleon, and obviously it was still a mess, but it's interesting that he made something that everyone still took a liking to, with the Constitution. Again, Napoleon, for all his, faults, is a great reformer, man. Like, he really is, like, a brilliant reformer. I could never take that away from Napoleon. And again, I think he would have ruled Spain better than the Spanish monarchy. The Spanish monarchy was a complete mess. And again, like, Napoleon, I think, could have ran Spain well with his reforms, at least, better than the Spanish royal family. But the problem is, again, he was a foreign occupier. The Spanish would rather have one of their own, even if they suck, rather than an overlord, a foreign overlord, right? That was the problem. So yeah, now we're back here with this guy, and he's showing, he's not in, you have to kind of get with the times. Like, 18th century's done now. Pre-Napoleon, Napoleon really did change the world, didn't he? Things were never the same after this guy. And yeah, just like things could never fully go back to the way they were after Napoleon,
At the urging of his advisors, the king reluctantly, very reluctantly, stepped back from his position. He would sign on to the liberal constitution. The King of Spain would become significantly less powerful, and most of the business of the country would be run through the Spanish legislature, which would be freely elected by the people. Spain would become one of the most liberal countries in Europe, with stronger political institutions than even Britain.
Wow.
The king said all of that, but he lied. Instead, he began exerting his power by vetoing every little thing that came out of the liberal Spanish legislature. He fired all of his elected liberal ministers and replaced them with unelected men who were only loyal to him. He then appealed to the 5 great powers and called for an international coalition to march into Spain and restore him to his full powers.
This man's insane. What the fudge?
Civil war now seemed inevitable, and
okay, so first of all, it reminds me of when we saw the English Civil War and freaking King Charles, right? He called on, like, I think it was Scotland to invade England so he can get back his throne. And I was kind of appalled by him, like, this dude really got a foreign power to invade his own country. Just, you know, like, I was appalled by that, and now this guy wants to essentially do that, but even in a greater scale. He wants all of Europe. Like, you don't think they would want to exert their influence or, you know, take something for themselves? I don't know. I think that was really dumb. And again, we see this a lot in history. Like, I think of, like, Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar of Russia, who, you know, said he would go along with certain reforms, but immediately pulled them back. You know, like, even, like, the last King Louis, before the first French Revolution, he would at least try to portray himself as compliant with the people's wants and needs, but then kind of roll it back. Like, that's the thing, like, no monarch wants to, I guess, give up all their power. Like, having absolute power is, like, a thing, but the thing is, the times, you know, you gotta see the writing on the wall, right? Like, things are changing. Monarchies are changing, like, you know, in 100 years, right, a war will be fought, which will eradicate the majority of monarchies in Europe. And, yeah, it's like, the monarchies are kind of in their last legs, right? At this point, things are changing, and you can't stop that. So, I can't believe this dude wanted all of Europe to basically invade his... That's insane.
And by making an international appeal, the Spanish king was taking an awful risk. Once the great powers got involved, Spain could turn into the arena for the next great power conflict. The country could be destroyed.
Yeah, no forethought, right? Completely...
Inspired by the courage and the success of the Spanish liberals, there were uprisings in Naples and Piedmont calling for liberal constitutions of their own. This movement had jumped international borders, which freaked out the great powers. It was their worst fears realized. It reminded them of the French Revolution. Everybody needed to be careful here. Metternich was particularly freaked out by the uprisings, not only because of his conservative ideology, but also because the countries in revolt happened to be Austria's neighbors. In correspondence with the other great powers, he expressed his fears that this may spark a wave of revolution across Europe. Since Italy was in Austria's sphere of influence, the other great powers agreed to give Austria a free hand to deal with the uprisings however they wished. In 1821, Austria marched into the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies to the south and the Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia to the west. In both cases, they came to the rescue of the existing conservative regimes. In short order, they put down the uprisings that were calling for new, Spanish-style liberal constitutions. The copycat uprisings were resolved, but the central problem of Spain remained. Of all the great powers, Britain greeted the calls for a Spanish intervention with the most skepticism. The Liberals in the British Parliament wholeheartedly supported the Spanish Liberals, but even the British Conservatives were sympathetic to their cause. They had gone through their own crisis with the monarchy in the 17th century, and even the most hardcore conservatives believed that Britain was better off for it. They viewed what was happening in Spain as part of a natural political evolution that every country must go through at some point. The Conservatives were in government in Britain, and the Conservative Foreign Secretary, Castlereagh, was dead set against any Spanish intervention. He publicly declared that he had never intended the Quadruple Alliance, by which he meant the four great powers that had brought down Napoleonic France, to be a, quote, union for the government of the world, or for the superintendence of the internal affairs of other states. He argued that the Spanish situation was not a threat to the peace in Europe. Prime Minister Liverpool agreed. The Emperor of Russia, Tsar Alexander, was on the opposite end of the spectrum. He believed that the uprising in Spain was the result of a coordinated international conspiracy, and that this conspiracy was an active threat to European stability. He was fully prepared to mobilize the Russian army and march it all the way across Europe in support of the Spanish king.
That kind of makes sense for Russia to be more gung-ho. I think of, like, again, the 1848 revolutions, and yeah, the czar of that video was very gung-ho about putting a stop to, like, any potential revolutions, right? So that kind of goes in line with how the Russians are seeing this. And yeah, again, I believe after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain enters into, like, what, 100 years of not mobilizing any forces on mainland Europe, kind of like their own little isolation. So that kind of makes sense. At least I believe that's how it went for Britain, you know. So yeah, it kind of makes sense. They're not wanting to basically create NATO or the League of Nations and everyone teaming up to just police the world, you know.
This freaked everybody out even more than the uprisings in Italy did. Nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted this. Metternich was particularly disturbed. He wanted to restore the Spanish king to his full powers, but not if it meant having the Russian army muddy their boots all over Europe. For some time, nobody was quite sure what to do about Spain. The great powers were afraid to do anything, and hoped that maybe Spain would just come to a compromise on their own. During this pause, something unexpected happened. British Foreign Secretary Castlereagh unexpectedly took his own life. He was replaced by a politician named George Canning.
Oh, wow.
Internationally, the news came as a thunderbolt. Castlereagh and Metternich had a special relationship, and the two were kinda co-authors of the post-war international system. Now, Metternich was on his own. He had no idea how this new fellow Canning might approach the post-war settlement. This news was equally distressing to Britain's political class. The current government was a moderate conservative government, and Castlereagh had been thought of as a pragmatic conservative that had good relations with the British Liberals. Canning had a different reputation. He was known as a conservative, kind of an attack dog, rabidly ideological, and not that well disposed toward the moderates currently leading the government. Castlereagh and Canning never really saw eye to eye. In fact, Castlereagh, how do you say this? Shot him? Things got so heated at one point during the war that the two exchanged pistol shots. Canning lost. So you can understand everybody's...
Freaking I like old politicians, freaking... That dueling was just something politicians could do. I think like President Andrew Jackson, who got into a crapload of duels, and then I think, you know, like, he's probably the most famous American to politician to keep getting into duels. But there's also like the infamous Alexander and Aaron Burr, you know, duels. A duel that took Alexander's life. And I don't know, there's just something funny. I would like to see freaking modern politicians try to pull crap like this. I'm sure they can't, but like, you know, it'd be hilarious if you thought, like, just freaking Donald Trump dueling somebody. That would be amazing. I'm sorry, that would be interesting. Politicians were different back then, at least in terms of they kill each other. I'm sure they maybe... You know, I'm not gonna go further with any of this. Just, you know, I find that funny.
Surprise when Canning replaced his longtime enemy as foreign secretary. Many legitimately wondered whether Canning would tear up all of Castlereagh's peace agreements and throw British foreign policy into chaos. But everybody was wrong about Canning. everybody.
How so?
In the immortal words of Robert Caro, power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. What did Canning's newfound power reveal about him? Well, before Castlereagh's death, Castlereagh had been consumed with the project of disentangling Britain from continental European affairs. Castlereagh didn't want to be sending the British army all over Europe to put down minor uprisings from people that were only asking for quite sensible reforms. To the surprise of all of his contemporaries, the supposed ideological attack dog Canning shared that vision. No armies in Europe. In fact, Canning went even further. He shared Castlereagh's belief that British prosperity depended upon how well they did out in the colonies. But unlike Castlereagh, he thought that trade, rather than colonialism, was really the thing that set Britain apart. Colonies were only useful insofar as they facilitated trade. They were not an end unto themselves. To that end, British interests lay in the pursuit of peace. Peace.
Okay, so I was correct earlier. Yeah, Britain kind of separates itself. Like, because I had heard, obviously, they hadn't fielded an army to mainland Europe until, like, the time of World War I believe. And obviously, we know that the British Empire, I believe, was just the largest empire in the world. And also, Britain basically became the powerhouse of the world, you know? And I think it's interesting that the whole colonialism and trade, like, Canning already impresses the heck out of me, because he gets it, you know? Like, off the bat. You think he was coming here to mess everything up, but no, he's, like, continuing. He's smart, obviously. And yeah, the pursuit of peace and trade has a big part to play in, like, why the British become the powerhouse that they do, right? So that's just, like, again, smart. Like, wow.
Facilitated trade, and trade made Britain prosperous. Unlike his predecessor, Canning was agnostic when it came to the colonies, and outright non-interventionist when it came to war. This makes Canning pretty unique in an era that was dominated by colonial obsession. Colonialism can make a country prosperous, but it can also be a trap. Canning was one of the few people who could see this clearly. There's one other thing that set Canning apart. He was a deeply committed slavery abolitionist. This didn't make his life any easier. It was a controversial stance for a British conservative to take.
So, yeah, already he's a man after my own heart. I officially love Canning. Just, wow, he's instantly become my favorite person.
And in fact, most abolitionists lived in the liberal Whig Party. Canning just felt it deep in his bones, which makes him cool, or at least as cool as a 19th century British politician can be. British politicians of this era liked to talk a big game when it came to political rights, but unlike many of his contemporaries, including his predecessor Castlereagh, Canning wasn't a goddamned hypocrite.
Okay, so Canning, like I said, he's won me over. I'm officially a Canning fanboy. I'm rooting for him for the rest of this video. I am now a fanboy of this man.
Canning had just become Foreign Secretary when the Spanish crisis finally boiled over. In 1823, the Spanish legislature, backed by the military, removed the king from power. The victorious Spanish Republicans got very excited by this move and began calling for a revolutionary Spanish Republic. This was bad. A Spanish Revolution so soon after the French Revolution threatened to plunge all of Europe into war again. The great powers would have preferred to sit back and wait for Spain to resolve its own crisis, but they couldn't ignore this development. France acted first. After briefly consulting with the other great powers, the conservative King of France sent the French army into Spain. Every other great power signed off on this intervention.
Deja vu, eh? Frickin' Spain, the French trying to deal with the oh boy. It didn't work out when Napoleon was around. It ain't gonna work out again. Like, if Napoleon couldn't subdue Spain, or any of his brilliant marshals, like, I don't know. That just seems incredibly like a bad idea.
Everyone except Britain. Metternich signed off on the intervention, but he wasn't happy about it. The international system was on the brink of collapse. One false move, and all of Europe would be at war. France restored the Spanish king to the throne, and then urged him to hammer out a compromise with the Spanish liberals. This was their big plan to resolve the crisis. Give the king everything he wanted, and then say, "Pretty please, will you do the thing that you have been refusing to do all along?"
Yeah, completely stupid. Like, this guy, the King of Spain, has proven he's not willing to compromise. He's not willing to change and get with the times, as it were. And so their big idea is, let's invade here and just put him back and tell him, or ask him rather, to please compromise. Oh, that is so... This entire thing is just comes across as incredibly dumb, in my opinion.
Why would he do that? It was an incoherent plan, and it turned out to be a catastrophic failure. Having received from the French everything he wanted, the Spanish king refused to even meet with his political opponents. Not only that, but now the Spanish liberals, republicans, and revolutionaries knew that there could be no political solution to this crisis. Any negotiated settlement would just be thrown out by the Spanish king and the French army. Now, the only way forward was through force of arms.
Yeah, they wanted to prevent a war, and now they've made the frickin' revolutionaries see that war is the only... Oh my goodness. Yeah, this was not well thought out, eh?
It really was a boneheaded move by the French. They had hoped to force a compromise, but instead, they had picked sides in a civil war and were now stuck occupying parts of Spain. This was the first great test for the new British Foreign Secretary Canning. In a speech before Parliament, he reaffirmed British neutrality over this matter, but noted at the end of his speech that he dearly hoped that the Spanish liberals would be victorious in their struggle against the tyrannical Spanish king and the French army. This was a shocking statement to the other great powers. They had all assumed that they were all on the same page, but apparently not. Apparently, the conservative government in Britain was sympathetic to the Spanish liberals and republicans and revolutionaries. It was a clever move by Canning. It sent a strong signal to the other powers that they could not necessarily count on British support if they wanted to march all over Europe, putting down liberal uprisings. If they pulled a stunt like this again, they might find Britain on the other side of the fight. British liberals, who up until now had looked at Canning with trepidation, heaped praise upon the conservative foreign secretary for orienting Britain as a defender of liberal movements all across Europe. British liberals were now confident that they had one of their own in the Foreign Office. Out on the streets, the people rushed to support Canning's declaration. Only 8 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the question on everybody's mind was, would France's recklessness lead to another great power conflict? The consensus on the streets was that by standing up to France and those other European tyrants who were eager to invade their neighbors over petty political disputes, Canning was the only person working to prevent another war. This made him unexpectedly popular with the British people. Before the speech, there had been a whisper campaign to remove Canning from power. After the speech, he was untouchable.
Wow, a genius in every sense of the word. He completely has everyone on their toes. No one is predicting what this man will do. He's already basically made a big move. He's shown the rest of Europe that he's essentially Britain's taking the lead, right? And everyone is seeing, oh snap, without the British, this is a big issues, and no one wants to make an enemy of the British, while at the same time separating Britain from the rest of mainland Europe, which also goes with his original goal of neutrality and basically pulling away from the conflicts of mainland Europe, right? Like, he's accomplishing so much. Like, there's so many layers and dimensions to this, and that speech accomplished so many goals. Again, like, I think I'm rooting for this man and his glorious bald head. You know, like, I love my baldies, guys. I was a fanboy of Marshall Davout. You know, like, bald people are geniuses. Okay, maybe not all, but you know what I mean. Like, I really am a fanboy of Caning now. Like, the dude is cool, in my opinion. In my 21st century American opinion, he's cool. In my book.
In the midst of all the chaos, something special was happening out in the Spanish colonies. In rapid-fire succession, the following Spanish colonies declared independence: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa.
Oh, so quick little cool fact about me. My family's from Nicaragua. My father's side was Salvadorian, but I don't know, my dad, he like left when I was born. So my mother's side comes from Nicaragua. Like, she and my grandparents were from here and they moved to America, so it's cool to see Nicaragua mentioned. That's kind of where I'm basically Central American, I guess, in terms of ethnicity, but I was born in America and I've been here my entire life, so I'm an American, but, you know, in terms of ethnicity, I hail from here, Central America, so it's cool to see this.
Costa Rica and Peru. Ecuador, Bolivia, and Uruguay would declare independence a little bit later, as would the Portuguese colony of Brazil. South America was having a moment, you might say. While all of this was going on, the Spanish king, backed by France, refused to negotiate with any of the South American revolutionaries. He refused to make even symbolic concessions that might have kept them under the Spanish crown. Canning saw an opportunity. He wanted Britain to be the first to recognize these newly independent states. He believed that having some friends in South America might prove to be a useful counterbalance against any other power trying to push into the region. And there was one other thing. Canning mistrusted the French. When it came to Spain, their true intentions were not yet clear. Why would they recklessly march into Spain like that? It made no sense. Canning feared that they may try to restart the lost French Empire by seizing all of Spain's colonies in the name of stability. If Canning saw to it that these newly independent states were recognized by the British government and supported by the British fleet, maybe France would think twice before doing something foolish like that. Canning began the process of recognizing the new South American states and sent a message to France saying that any French adventurism in South America would be interpreted by Britain as an act of war. The French fell all over themselves, assuring Canning that this was never their intention. Regardless,
dude really is now the big boss of all of the world, essentially. Like, Canning is smart, and the rest of Europe is fumbling. They're like, we don't want beef, we don't want the smoke with Britain. Like, wow, this man's a baller.
As to whether that was true or not, they heard the message loud and clear. Canning's diplomatic maneuver was remarkably successful. At a later international conference, the question of reconquering Spain's lost colonies was floated. When France informed the other great powers of Britain's threat, the matter was immediately dropped. Canning's threat worked. Peace in South America was preserved at no cost to Britain. The other great powers were also put on notice. If they wanted to go around the world opportunistically snapping up colonies, they would need to go through Britain first. Pax Britannica at its finest.
Genius.
Marvel Studios Thunderbolt is certified.
At this time, I would like to ask all Americans to leave the room.
Hot dog is my favorite meat. I love hot
Well, guys, I guess I have to end the video now. This was fun, I enjoyed it, but I can't stick around anymore, because I'm an American, so it was a great video. I'm joking, I'm gonna have to watch this for the content, but, I'm wondering what he's gonna say now.
I love hot dogs. I love hot dogs. I love hot dogs. I love hot dogs.
Shortly after the wave of revolutions in South America, Canning began collaborating with the American Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. What came out of this collaboration was the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The Monroe Doctrine, really developed by Secretary of State Adams, stated, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as future subjects for colonization by any European power." The funny thing about this declaration was that at the time, it was completely unenforceable. Or I should say, it was completely unenforceable by the Americans. But you know who could enforce it? The British. The Monroe Doctrine declared no new colonization of North or South America. No new colonization meant that the current colonization was locked in place. Who did that help? Britain, at this time, was by far the #1 European power in North America, and with these new revolutions in the Spanish colonies, it was fast becoming the #1 European power in South America. If Spain, or France, or any other power attempted to move back into South America, the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States would resist, which in effect meant that the United States would defend British interests.
He essentially deadlocked him. He deadlocked everyone. He deadlocked Europe from colonizing, and he's made America pay for the pay for the defense. Wow. That's just... Wow. We're gonna build a wall and we're gonna make the Americans pay for it. No, I'm joking. We're gonna build a blockade and the Americans are gonna defend it. You know, the thing about John Quincy Adams is that he's acknowledged as a genius, a very smart man, very accomplished, was even in fact involved with the first revolution, the American Revolution, implying we've had more than one, we've only had one, but he was involved even as a child under the tutelage of his father, John Adams, who was the second president, and, you know, he is a genius. Learning about him, the man is smart, and beyond intelligent, but it's often been said that the highlight of his career is everything he did while he wasn't president, and that the low point of his career was being president, because he, due to factors, wasn't the most effective in getting what he wanted across, you know? Yeah, so John Quincy Adams, an intelligent man, but unfortunately his lowest point probably in his life and career was his presidency, you know? Yeah. So again, Canning has just outsmarted the entire world, and you can see why the British were probably the strongest empire in the world, right?
Pushing the Americans in this direction was a masterstroke by Canning. They didn't really understand at the time that this declaration committed the American Navy to defending British sugar plantations on Jamaica, but it did. And in exchange for this, the British gave the Americans nothing. Canning said of the Monroe Doctrine when it was first announced, quote, "The effect of the ultra-liberalism of our Yankee cooperators on the ultra-despotism of our allies gives me just the balance I wanted." By this he means that, yes, the British and the French were playing nice at the moment, but if that ever changed, the Americans would serve as a useful counterbalance against French overseas expansion. Canning felt free to speak more plainly a year later, after all the dust had settled. He described the Monroe Doctrine as, quote, "an act which will make a change in the face of the world almost as great as the discovery of the continent now set free. The Yankees will shout in triumph, but it is they that lose most by our decision."
Completely played. Wow, man made so many big chess moves. He's playing chess, everyone else is playing checkers.
It must be said that Caning didn't get everything he wanted. The Monroe Doctrine contained a massive loophole that allowed for American colonialism, which did make Caning nervous, especially when he looked at the American ambitions toward the Caribbean and the newly independent Mexico. But as a general principle, Caning had secured American support against any European power moving into North or South America. It was a diplomatic coup for the British. Okay, the Americans can come back into the room now.
I love hot dogs. I love hot dogs. I love hot dogs. Hot dog is my favorite.
I actually don't like hot dogs. I don't know why, I've never liked them. I find them kind of disgusting. I'll eat them, but I'm not a fan of them.
Meat, my favorite meat, my favorite meat.
Get the dogs out.
Go get it, Doug.
The great powers never went to war over Spain, but it was a very near thing. France would end their misguided occupation after 5 years, and political instability within Spain would persist for the next 40 years, or 80 years, or 120 years. Or let's just say that political instability within Spain would persist.
It never ended.
However, the Spanish crisis proved that the post-war peace was more fragile than anybody realized. The great powers walked away having learned several lessons. First, Metternich was beginning to lose his grip on Europe. He had been the great man during the post-war settlement, but after 8 years, he was becoming increasingly distracted by the Austrian occupation of Italy and by the festering issues within the German Confederation. The international system that he had helped design was still intact, but with France's reckless invasion of Spain, it had entered a new phase, one where he was no longer the main character. Second, Britain, under Caning's stewardship, had fully emerged as the greatest of the great powers. The Spanish crisis taught everybody that when Britain put its foot down, every other great power hesitated. It was a new world. And then, lastly, there was France. What to say about France? They got off to such a good start by successfully reintegrating themselves back into the international system under Richelieu. But after that, it seems like they were bonked over the head with an idiot stick. Well, in a way, they were. I've talked around this point up until now, but right around the time that France recklessly invaded Spain, the government of France underwent an abrupt ideological shift. They abandoned the Grand Compromise that had restored the monarchy to power and decided to lurch quite suddenly in a conservative and autocratic direction. This decision set up a chain of events in France that would have profound consequences for the rest of the 19th century.
It is so late right now, it's like nearly midnight. I'm gonna have to end the video quickly, but again, we're gonna be looking at the July Revolution tomorrow, so stay tuned, my friends. Bye, everyone.